In August 2012, a team of archaeologists cut a trench through the asphalt of a Leicester Council car park. Within hours of breaking ground, they hit bone. What came out of that pit over the following weeks didn't just identify a lost king. It exposed a 500-year-old LIE sitting at the center of the British royal family tree, a lie so significant that when the genetics came back, the scientists reportedly had to run the test twice because they assumed they'd made a mistake. For centuries, Richard III existed in the English imagination as a monster, a hunchback tyrant who murdered his own nephews to steal a crown. That image came almost entirely from one source, William Shakespeare, writing 100 years after Richard's death under a Tudor monarchy that had every reason to make the man they'd killed look as evil as possible. History, it turns out, is usually written by whoever wins the battle. And in 1485, at a muddy field outside a town called Bosworth, Richard III lost. To understand why his body ended up under a parking lot, you have to understand what came before it. Richard was born in 1452, the youngest surviving son of Richard, Duke of York, in the middle of a civil war that would later be nicknamed the Wars of the Roses. Two branches of the same royal family, York and Lancaster, spent 3 decades tearing England apart over who had the legitimate right to the throne. Richard's own father was killed in that fighting when Richard was 8 years old. His older brother Edward eventually won the crown as Edward IV, and Richard, still a teenager, was sent north to Yorkshire to help hold the family's power base. By most contemporary accounts, he was good at it, loyal, competent, a capable military commander who fought for his brother for over a decade without any recorded ambition for the throne himself. Then, in April 1483, Edward IV died unexpectedly at 40. His heir was his 12-year-old son, also named Edward. Richard was named Lord Protector, responsible for guiding the boy to the throne. Instead, within 3 months, Richard had declared his brother's marriage invalid, which made the 2 young princes illegitimate, and had himself crowned King Richard III. The boys, Edward and his younger brother Richard, were moved into the Tower of London, ostensibly for their own protection. They were seen playing in the Tower Gardens that summer. By the end of it, they were never seen again. Whether Richard ordered their deaths has been argued by historians for 5 centuries, and no body has ever been conclusively identified as either boy. But the disappearance was enough. It gave his enemies exactly the story they needed. 2 years later, a relatively unknown Lancastrian claimant named Henry Tudor landed in Wales with a small mercenary army and marched to meet Richard at Bosworth Field. Richard died in that battle, and how he died is written directly into his skeleton. When archaeologists eventually recovered his remains, they counted at least 11 separate wounds inflicted at or around the time of death, 9 of them to the skull. Contemporary accounts describe Richard charging directly at Henry Tudor's position in a last desperate bid to end the battle by killing his rival outright. It nearly worked. But somewhere in that charge, Richard's horse went down, or he was unhorsed, and once a mounted knight lost his horse in the middle of a battlefield, he was finished. The skull damage tells that story. A blade strike sliced away part of the back of his head. Another wound punched clean through from one side to the other. He appears to have lost his helmet before the fatal blows landed, which lines up with accounts of him fighting on foot at the very end, surrounded. Henry Tudor became Henry VII. Richard's body was stripped, thrown over the back of a horse, and paraded through Leicester as proof that the last Plantagenet king was dead. He was buried without ceremony at Grey Friars, a Franciscan friary in the town. No monument, no effigy, just a grave, reportedly too short for the body, forcing whoever dug it to prop the head up at an angle against the earth. Then, decades later, Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries. Grey Friars was torn down, its stones sold off, and the site was eventually built over. By the time anyone thought to ask exactly where Richard III was buried, nobody could answer. Rumors circulated for centuries that his bones had been dug up and thrown into a nearby river out of spite. For over 500 years, that was where the story ended. A king erased so completely that even his grave became a myth. The propaganda machine that erased his grave worked just as hard on his reputation. Tudor historians, writing for a dynasty that had seized the throne by force and needed to look legitimate, painted Richard as a physically twisted, morally rotten usurper. Shakespeare, writing under Henry VIII's granddaughter Elizabeth I, took that portrait and made it permanent. His Richard III opens with the king describing himself as deformed, unfinished, a villain who murders his way to power and revels in it. It's one of the most quoted openings in English literature, and it shaped how Richard III was understood for 400 years, largely because nobody had any physical evidence to check it against. That changed because of one historian's stubbornness. Philippa Langley had spent years researching Richard, and she had become convinced, based on overlaying old maps of Leicester onto the modern street grid, that his remains were still in the ground beneath what was now a council car park, specifically under a painted letter R that had been sprayed on the tarmac for an unrelated parking space marking, which Langley and others would later note as an almost unbelievable coincidence. She pushed for years to get an excavation funded. Most academic historians treated the idea as a long shot at best. The University of Leicester agreed to dig, largely to search for the footprint of the old friary itself, with locating an actual identifiable skeleton considered a secondary, unlikely bonus. On the first day of digging, in the very first trench, the team found human leg bones. That alone should have been close to impossible. The odds of striking the exact right skeleton on day one, in a car park that had been redeveloped multiple times over 5 centuries, were remote enough that the lead archaeologist has said publicly he assumed it was probably an unrelated burial. But as the team carefully exposed more of the skeleton over the following days, the details started lining up in a way that was hard to dismiss as coincidence. The grave itself was wrong in almost every way a royal burial should be right. It was rough, uneven, and too short, forcing the body into an awkward, slightly propped position. There was no coffin, no evidence of a shroud. The hands appeared to be crossed at the wrists in a position consistent with having been bound, though not certainly. This wasn't the resting place of an anointed king. It looked exactly like what the old accounts described, a hasty, undignified burial of a dead enemy, done quickly and without ceremony by monks who likely wanted the body off their hands. The skeleton belonged to an adult male who had died somewhere in his late 20s to late 30s. Richard III died at 32. That matched. The bones showed no sign of a shortened arm or dramatic limp that Tudor legend had also attached to him. What they did show was scoliosis, a sideways curvature of the spine that had developed during adolescence and would have made one shoulder visibly higher than the other and somewhat shortened the torso. It was significant, but it was not the grotesque hunchback of Shakespeare's play. A skilled tailor and well-fitted armor could largely disguise it, and it would not have prevented an active, physically capable adult life, which lined up with a man who by every historical account rode, fought, and led troops in battle for over a decade. And then there were the wounds. Beyond the fatal skull injuries, the skeleton showed a wound to the pelvis, a thin blade injury that had gone in from behind and below, the kind of wound consistent with an attack after death, delivered as a final insult to the corpse while it lay exposed, which matched the humiliating treatment described in contemporary accounts of the bodies parading through Leicester. Every physical detail matched, but detail matching isn't proof. To move from this, looks like it could be him too. This is definitively Richard III. The team needed something that couldn't be argued with, and in 2012, that meant DNA. Extracting usable genetic material from a skeleton that had spent 5 centuries in wet British clay is genuinely difficult. DNA degrades over time, and burial conditions like these accelerate the damage badly. The team focused on mitochondrial DNA specifically because it behaves differently from the DNA most people think of. Mitochondrial DNA is passed down almost unchanged from mother to child, generation after generation, through the maternal line only. A man doesn't pass his mitochondrial DNA to his children at all. That makes it a uniquely stable genetic thread you can trace backward through history, as long as you can find someone alive today who descends from the same mother's line. Richard III had no surviving legitimate children, but he had an older sister, Anne of York, and Anne's female descendants would carry the same mitochondrial signature Richard did. Genealogists traced that maternal line down 17 generations in roughly 550 years through the collapses and remarriages and quiet obscurity of centuries, and found it hadn't broken. It led to a man named Michael Ibsen, a furniture maker living in London who had been building things out of wood his entire adult life without any idea his family tree connected him to a king who'd been dead for half a millennium. Ibsen gave a cheek swab. The lab sequenced his mitochondrial DNA and compared it against the degraded genetic material pulled from the skeleton's teeth and femur. It matched. Not approximately. It matched on a rare subgroup of the maternal line shared by a tiny fraction of the population. The kind of genetic signature that, combined with the wounds, the scoliosis, the age at death, and the location, put the statistical odds of this being anyone other than Richard III at effectively zero. In February 2013, the University of Leicester announced it to the world. The skeleton under the car park was, beyond reasonable scientific doubt, Richard III. That should have been the end of the science. Instead, it was the beginning of the part almost nobody expected. Because mitochondrial DNA only tells half a genealogical story, the research team decided to also test the Y chromosome, which is passed down the opposite way, father to son, largely unchanged for generations, in exactly the same way surnames traditionally travel through a family. If Richard's identity as Plantagenet royalty was genetically real, his Y chromosome should closely match that of other confirmed male line descendants of the same paternal ancestor, the House of Plantagenet's founding line stretching back through Edward III. The team located several living men who, according to extensively documented genealogical paper trails, descended in an unbroken male line from that same royal ancestor through a branch of the family connected to the Dukes of Beaufort. On paper, their Y chromosomes and Richard's should have lined up closely. This was meant to be confirmation, essentially a formality after the mitochondrial match had already done the heavy lifting. It wasn't. When the results came back, Richard's Y chromosome did not match the modern descendants. At some point across those generations, the documented paternal line and the actual biological paternal line had diverged. In genetics, this is called a false paternity event, and it simply means that somewhere in that family tree, a child was born who was not biologically the son of the man everyone believed was his father. It could have happened at any point across 19 generations. It could have happened once or more than once. There is no way to pinpoint exactly where. What matters is what it implies. If the break occurred early enough in that line, it raises real questions about the paternity of figures well beyond Richard himself, including his own brother Edward IV, whose legitimacy would go on to matter enormously to English history, because Edward's children are the very princes who vanished from the Tower of London. Interestingly, there were already rumors during Edward IV's own lifetime spread by his enemies that he himself wasn't the legitimate son of the Duke of York. Nobody has ever been able to prove that rumor true. The 2014 genetic findings published in the journal Nature Communications don't prove it either, but they demonstrate with hard data that a break in the legitimate bloodline happened somewhere in that family within the relevant historical window, at a time when the entire justification for who deserved the English crown rested on exactly that bloodline being unbroken and legitimate. It's a strange kind of historical irony. The Wars of the Roses were fought, on paper, over which branch of one family had the truest royal blood. Tens of thousands of people died over that question across 3 decades. And centuries later, a DNA lab quietly demonstrated that the blood itself may not have been what anyone on either side believed it was. That genetic wrinkle also reframes the most famous unsolved crime in English royal history. The traditional accusation against Richard has always been motive. He supposedly murdered his nephews because their survival threatened his claim to the throne. But Richard had already taken the throne through a legal argument declaring his brother's marriage invalid and the boys illegitimate. Under that legal framework, they were no longer a direct threat to his crown in the way a legitimate heir would be. Someone else in this story had a much sharper motive and much more to lose if those 2 boys stayed alive. Henry VII took the crown by right of conquest, not by a strong hereditary claim of his own. His claim to royal blood was genuinely weak, distant, and disputed. To shore it up, he married Elizabeth of York, the sister of the missing princes, folding the York bloodline into his new Tudor dynasty. But that strategy only worked cleanly if the boys themselves were gone. If either prince had still been alive after Bosworth, he would have had a stronger direct claim to the throne than Henry did, and would have remained a live threat to the new dynasty for as long as he breathed. 2 years passed between the prince's disappearance and Richard's death at Bosworth, and no credible sighting of either boy surfaces after Richard takes the throne. It's entirely possible Richard is guilty exactly as history remembers him. But it's also true that the man who benefited most from their permanent disappearance, and who then spent decades funding chroniclers to paint Richard as a child-murdering monster, was Henry VII. None of this is settled. It probably never will be, unless remains that can be conclusively identified as the princes themselves are ever found and tested, which so far has not happened, despite bones matching roughly the right ages having been discovered in the tower in 1674 and never subjected to modern forensic analysis. What did get settled in a very literal sense was where Richard III would finally rest. His identification triggered a genuinely heated dispute. Leicester, where he was found, wanted to keep him. York, the region his family was named for and where he'd spent much of his life before becoming king, argued he belonged there instead. The legal fight went all the way to the High Court, which ultimately ruled that Leicester Cathedral, close to where the friary had once stood, would be his final resting place. In March 2015, Richard III was reburied with the full state ceremony he'd been denied 5 centuries earlier, complete with a formal procession, a specially commissioned tomb of Swaledale fossil stone, and a service broadcast to millions of people who, 3 years earlier, had no reason to think a medieval king's bones were sitting under a parking space. The skeleton is on permanent display now, in a sense, through the visitor center built directly on the excavation site, where you can look down at the exact spot the trench first struck bone. Michael Ibsen, the furniture maker whose cheek swab helped confirm the whole story, was among the pallbearers at the reburial. What makes this case remarkable isn't just that a lost king was found under a parking lot, although that alone would be a strange enough story. It's that hard forensic science took a 500-year-old political narrative, built and maintained by the winning side, and picked it apart piece by piece. The scoliosis was real, but the grotesque hunchback was theater. The wounds told a story of a man who died fighting, not fleeing. And the DNA, instead of simply confirming the official royal family tree everyone already believed in, quietly revealed that the tree itself had a break in it nobody knew was there. Bones don't care who won the war. They don't care which dynasty needed a villain to justify its own claim to power. They just sit in the ground, waiting. And eventually, the right combination of a stubborn historian, a lucky trench, and a lab that can read 500-year-old genetic code will pull the truth back out, whether it flatters anyone or not. If you found this one as strange as I did, let me know in the comments what part of this story surprised you most. The wounds, the parking lot, or that Y chromosome mismatch. And if you want more stories where modern science quietly rewrites history, subscribe, because there are a lot more of these buried out there.